This podcast is brought to you by Spirits and Distilling for those who make and drink great spirits. Join our free email newsletter for technical and creative distilling stories in your inbox every week. Learn more at spiritsanddistilling.com.
Hey guys, welcome back to the Craft Spirits and Distilling podcast. My name is Sydney Jones. I'm your host. Today we are interviewing my good friend Sherrie Moore, who is an absolute incredible veteran of the whiskey industry. She has a 49-year career in production, with 31 of those years being spent at Jack Daniel's. She retired as the director of whiskey operations. She has done everything from barrel analysis and chemistry, warehousing, distilling, processing, quality control. Any job that you can think of at Jack Daniel's, this woman held it, and she held it so well. And I'm thrilled to have her on board talking to us today. She currently owns her own consulting company called Moore Whiskey. And we're going to talk a little bit about her career at Jack Daniel's and how she helped to build that company into what it is today and has influenced a lot of your favorite whiskey, more than likely. But before we get into all of that, G&D Chillers understands that each distillery's chilling requirements are unique. On every distillery project, G&D offers the front-end design and engineering your team needs at no cost to you. Jim Kerr, VP of Manufacturing at Red Boot Beverages, says, G&D has been with us since the early days. Their knowledgeable engineers and service techs are there when we need them. We're in the midst of a large expansion, and they have been right there with us to select chiller solutions for today and the future. Reach out for a quote today at gdchillers.com. Hi, Sherrie.
Hello.
So Sherrie is in town, in Bardstown with me, which is so much fun. I love doing in-person conversations. Not that doing them from afar isn't fun. It's always fun talking to my friends, but it's really great having Sherrie in my house drinking my whiskey, and it's just awesome. I saw her last at Kentucky Bourbon Festival.
Yes.
Yeah. How did you enjoy KBF this year?
I loved it.
It was my first time going.
What I really liked is this year I had an Airbnb where I could walk.
Oh,
and so I could come and go. And just Bardstown is so much fun during the festival.
Walking to and from Bardstown is really the game changer. Mm-hmm. It makes everything so much easier and better as someone who lives downtown and just walks kind of everywhere. Can you believe it's been a year also since you and I met? Last year, we were at gin school together. So I occasionally, with Molly, do teaching at a beverage laboratory in Lexington, Kentucky, and we teach gin. Molly, much better than I do, but I do some formulation and cocktail stuff, and that's where I met Sherrie. Sherrie was there to learn about gin.
Yeah, that was a good workshop for me. I didn't have any knowledge, up close on operations or the taste profile of gin, just what I'd read. It didn't take me long to know that I respect and I appreciate gin, but I'm too late in my career to go down that path because there's so much to know with the botanicals, and it's a very involved process. So it was good exposure for me. But it also told me that if I have a gin question, I'm calling you or Molly. I'm not going to try to answer it.
I was going to say, as someone who has such an incredible career in whiskey, when you kind of approached that class, like if you wanted to create a gin, but coming from a whiskey background, what would you gravitate towards, you think?
Well, the one that I saw real fast is I would want to do more traditional method. Mm-hmm. I would want to be sourcing very similar to the way we do with our whiskey. I'd want to know where those botanicals were coming from. I'd want to know they were good. And I wouldn't be buying vodka and adding some flavors to it. I would be doing it the traditional way. I would want, whether it was infused or the basket, I would want to do it as true to that. I love learning the tradition of anything because I think once you know the tradition and what's been done, that's when you can innovate. And a lot of people just start innovating and they may luck up on something. But whatever you, I know when I was at Jack Daniel's, I was lucky. I'm probably jumping into something, but we kept probably 1,000 to 2,000 barrels under experimentation. So we were testing We even took barrels and took wax, like the same wax that you put on apples. We sprayed barrels with wax.
Like a paraffin wax.
Yes.
Yeah.
So we sprayed those to see if we could keep the interaction for flavor, but reduce the angel share during maturation. Well, we coat those barrels, and the guys would be kicking them, and they were so slick. Instead of kicking it and going 15 or 20 feet, the thing may go 30 feet, go crazy, and almost hit 4 people.
Oh,
so they
God.
were so dangerous.
It's like high-risk shuffleboard.
It was. So then we took barrels and we put shrink wrap on them. We actually took shrink wrap and we did that. And then those barrels, you would kick it and it would go 3 inches. So we did both spectrums. We were so glad from an operational point of view that neither one of those tests work. But I always loved doing the experiments. We were doing used barrels, rechar, and this was in the 80s. So we were always trying to learn something. We were doing barrels finished in sherry and rum back in the 1990s. Just one time, the consumers weren't ready. But I worked with Lincoln Henderson on that. Mm-hmm. And so when he came out with Angel's Envy, it made me so happy because I thought, the background had already been done. And he knew the timing and did great with that brand. But he knew how whiskey aged in a bourbon barrel and a new bourbon barrel. So he was able to take it and add that step. Mm-hmm. He didn't just go, we're going to try these barrels. So that's where I like having that the traditional way, and then you go and innovate.
Yeah. 2 thoughts. 1,000% agree. You really have to master the basics before you get fancy or weird or crazy. And sometimes I find in the craft distillery world, especially, is that you have all these amazing ideas and you want to do all of them, but it's really establishing like a very good core standard to your products that really needs to be paramount. My second thought is I used to receive brand new charred barrels all the time that were shrink wrapped.
Yes.
And and it's still super, super common, but I kind of feel like an asshole because I would get visitors to the distillery all the time. They're like, are those barrels filled that are shrink wrapped? And I'd say, no one would ever do that. Jack Daniels did that.
Jack Daniels did that.
So funny. So now I have to amend all of my statements whenever.
Only once. So. Yeah. Only once.
If you've been on a distillery tour with me and I said that no one has ever shrink wrapped a filled whiskey barrel, I'm sorry. I was wrong. It's not real. It happened once. But 49 years in whiskey, 31 years at Jack Daniels. Can you walk me and also our listeners through kind of your history with that company? You've done every single aspect of operations, and even on the marketing side and the visitor center side, you know every aspect of the business.
Well, that's what happens when you're 67 years old and you stick with the same career. But if anybody's been to Lynchburg, or if you look online, there's a restaurant there called Miss Mary Bobo's Boarding House. And that was my great-grandmother. And how my career started is I was going to college and she wanted me to come live with her. And I said, well, if I could get a job. And so she was tied with the marketing. So she called them and said, I want Sherrie to work there. So the next day I got a phone call and I started working summers and weekends at the visitor center at Jack Daniels. And one piece of trivia about that is in 1979 was the first year that Jack Daniels hit 100,000 visitors. And now tourism is big all across Kentucky and really across the country. But Jack was one of the first ones to really start that. But I look back now, 100,000 in 1979 was a lot of people coming through a little town. So I had an academic scholarship in chemistry. And so I had my tuition paid for. I didn't have any money. And so working summers and weekends gave me the cash I needed for everything else. So part of my scholarship, I worked for a chemistry professor. Well, he was actually doing research and development for Jack Daniels. So he would put me on projects, and I may be in the research in tannins. and learning about oak and getting the paperwork and giving it to the professor. Also, we would get slop, and I was drying it to see how many solids were in there, the percent. So never really thinking that I would work there for the rest of my life. But I was meeting the consumers at the visitor center on summers and weekends, and then I was my chemistry degree and then working for this professor. So then I graduated, and I was one of these people that changed their major almost every semester. It's embarrassing, but I couldn't figure out what I wanted to do. But I always stuck in math and science. I had some engineering. I had some computer classes. And I actually ended up with a good core group of classes to go into a distillery that was still relatively small. I mean, it was a little over 1 million cases, but for a big brand, it was relatively small. So at that time versus 20 million now. And so having that background that I could work with engineering because I knew enough. You know, there would be times I'd say, y'all, we need to increase filtration. And they say, we can't do it. And I go, no, we can do it. We just may be cost prohibitive, but we can do it. So you're going to have to calculate. So I just knew enough to kind of push engineering. And also, if I was running projects, I had that. And where I had taken some computer classes, it turned out to be good because we were just starting to put barrel inventory off a ledger. We had a hand ledger that then got copied onto microfiche. So we were able to, I was there and I understood how to lay out the information because I wanted to be able to sort. I was already doing the sampling of the whiskey, so I knew that I wanted to sort so I could look at everything on the 7th floor. I could look at everything on the 5th. I wanted to look at the outside barrels versus the interior barrels. So I was glad I had that little bit of background because it let me be able to put the information right. Because it's one thing I learned in computer, you cannot pull out what you don't put in. And it sounds elementary, but it is so important.
1,000%. Nicole Austin and I have that conversation now that AI is coming into the conversation with, new startup distilleries and those who may consider AI for their operation. You can't just pull AI out of thin air. You have to feed it before it can do anything for you, Very similar.
So you have to think what you're going to feed it. So I worked on so it turned out that my change in majors ended up working in my favor. So I I didn't do this on purpose. But when I graduated, I thought, well, you know what? I might as well stay here. I'm comfortable here. So, just a funny thing, we didn't have an HR department, so I called the plant manager's secretary and said, I think I want to work here if there's an opening. Never met the plant manager, never had an interview, called back once, the secretary did, and asked me, did you have biology too or just chemistry? And I said, yes. And then the next Monday I started. Never met the plant manager. So that was small town, no HR. And so that's how I was the first woman at Jack, anyway, that was not a secretary or in the bottling house. So for me to go into quality control, and with quality control, we ran tests to support the distillery and our barrel warehousing, but we also ran the cistern room and the filtration of the whiskey. So I was the first woman not to be in a traditional role. I'm 22. I'm country as cornbread. And I probably should have been a little more intimidated or thinking, but I grew up with horses and out in the country. So this just seemed kind of natural for me to go in there.
It's us horse girls, man.
Yeah.
I was a horse girl. This explains actually a lot about why I am the way why I am, is because you and I spent our childhoods wrangling 1,800-pound animals and getting them to do things that they did not want to do, but convincing them that they liked it. And
so I never walked in like, oh, I'm a woman, I can't do this. Nor was I, oh, I'm a woman, y'all be special to me or don't mistreat me. So I just went in as Sherrie. And it worked. A lot of times people ask me how hard it was in the 70s and 80s being a woman in the industry. And I don't know if anybody treated me as the woman. I was just Sherrie. And I think when you come in at 18 like that, then people just, they almost take you in under their wing. So I came in 1979 to the lab, able to use my chemistry degree. And one of the best things I had going for me is the average seniority was probably 35 years at Jack Daniel's at the time. So I had all these people with a wealth of institutional knowledge. They may not be able to tell you a formula, but they know what that pump's supposed to sound like. They know how things are supposed to smell. But also, being in the lab, worked with our corporate R&D. So I got to work with people that had PhDs that were also sharing all this knowledge. So I had people on both ends of the spectrum sharing knowledge with me. Mm-hmm. And I guess I'm just nosy. I was always asking people, why are you doing that? Why do we do this? And people love to tell you what they're doing. And so by just asking questions, I learned so much from those guys.
That's really cool. You notably were at Jack Daniel's in a really transformational period for the whiskey industry in the 70s and the 80s and the 90s.
Yes.
What was that like, being at such a iconic brand while vodka was just surging? Because I know how the bourbon industry responded to it, and I know it happened on the bourbon side. I'm less clear with what Tennessee whiskey, aka just Jack, did during that time.
Well, they did a lot of their focus on the international market. So our growth slowed, but we really didn't, we just kind of plateaued. But we had overproduced on distillation. So we ended up having to take some warehouses. We had too much whiskey. And even though our sales didn't go down, we had overproduced, thinking that we were going to have 15% compounded growth. Well, when you do 15% compounded and you're plateaued, you've got too much whiskey. So it was a good learning experience. It was one of those that you kind of hate, but it's easier to maintain your barrel warehouses when they're almost full, because you take something out, you put something in. So you just naturally have your inventory spread out on different floors. But when you go down in production and you're still dumping your barrels, you're still doing your withdrawals, you're having to really plan. You don't want to plan and pull all 84 proof. You're having to learn how to mingle those different ages and the different floors. The other challenge we had, and it took us a while before we realized it, is we had a lot of warehouses that the whiskey was up on the top floor, but not on the bottom floors. So we were having to move barrels just because of the warehouse structural integrity. Mm-hmm. Because so much, I love the Busick designed warehouses. I think they're wonderful. But part of the design is that the barrels have to be in the right places.
Yeah.
You need that load spread. So we had 2 warehouses that shifted, and we had to go through and learn how to support those. But it could have been prevented if we had gotten on to managing our warehouse space. So I've gone through having too much whiskey. Well, when I first started, we didn't have enough. And I loved it because I'd never had overtime in my whole life. And on Friday, we wouldn't dump whiskey because we didn't have anything old enough that met approval. And we may have to come in on Saturday. So I would just do nothing on Friday. And then on Saturday, come in and dump whiskey because it was finally had a batch that was approved. So we had something for Monday. So I went through just hand to mouth on whiskey. Then it was, what do we do with this older whiskey?
That's what I was going to ask, especially since you were doing QC and you were in the lab at the time. How were you guys interpreting during this plateau period? Your whiskey's getting older.
Yes.
And you might see standards starting to change and standard offerings and standard bottlings, their profiles might start to shift with this extra age that they're getting. How did you guys kind of account for that? Did you create new SKUs? Did you thoughtfully blend? Did you do all these things and more?
We did several things. Of course, this is about the time we ended up coming out with Gentleman Jack. So that was the first new product they had since Prohibition. They just had Jack Daniel's and Lemon Motlow. after Prohibition. And it had a black and a green label on the Jack, old number 7. But that's when we came out with Gentleman Jack, because it gave us a way to do that extra filtration step that we could kind of refine that flavor, even though it had an older age. Then we went to realizing that we had this growth coming. And one thing I mentioned to you earlier is we were going, oh no, we're going to have to bring this age down. But we liked our flavor profile. So how do we do that? Well, about that time, Brown-Forman had bought some wineries. They bought Sonoma-Cutrer, Fetzer, and because Brown-Forman, that owns Jack Daniels, has always had their cooperage and made their bourbon barrels. They decided, well, if we're going to own wineries, we're going to make our barrels. So they're learning how to make wine barrels. And we find out about toasting. Not that we hadn't heard about it, but we find out more about toasting and how the wine industry were toasting barrels, and they had a chart with flavor units. And we were fascinated with it. And then we got looking at our process. Is that the way let's say in the 1800s, when barrels were being built and they were charring them, they would have a slow fire built before the char. So actually they were toasting the barrels. And all along as an industry, we thought what was happening is the char, what our eyes could see. But it was really that slow. And then, and this was probably, I don't know, I don't even want to say, but maybe 50s or 60s, they started charring with the gas heat. And it was a rapid fire. And it would be for so many seconds. And I think when we changed from the slow method of charring to this quick, we lost our toasting. And honestly, didn't really know we had toasting going on.
Well, and that char just happens to coincide with when bourbon was named our national spirit.
Yes.
And the standards of identity were established. And what a coinky-dink.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. So we started learning about toasting, and that was a way that we could get more flavor from the barrel by toasting. And so that's one of the things. And now it's such an industry standard. Mm-hmm. There's some brands that do all toasted barrels. There's people that finish in a toasted barrel. But to me, that's one of the things that probably one of the biggest breakthroughs we might have had. And it really wasn't anything new. It's just an understanding of what was happening with the wood.
Exactly. Toasting is one of my favorite kind of levers that you can pull when it comes to barrel selection. We have toasted products at Heaven Hill. We have the toasted barrel, which was our bourbon, Elijah Craig, that super successful product. And we just came out with the Elijah Craig toasted rye, which is arguably my favorite rye whiskey on the market right now. And I had always been familiar with toasting from like a craft perspective. And I had always just kind of assumed that it was just something that you naturally got underneath your char. And now that I have a better understanding of toasting and what it does for your barrel flavor-wise, for the listeners that are not as familiar with the toasting process, can you give a down and dirty just explanation of what toasting is?
Well, it's slow, and, different places do it different ways. But at one time, we had a very set formula at Brown-Forman. But my illustration that I try to tell people is sourdough bread is good. But when you toast it, it's better because that heat and the slowness of that toast is going to create more sugars and caramels and more flavors are developed. It was good bread, but it is fabulous toast. And so I think that's my just simple way of saying that this oak has so many flavors in it. And even without toasting, we were still getting flavors as an industry in our product.
Yeah.
But once we went in there and toasted it, but it's just you are slowly toasting it. You are not turning on the broiler and putting that black layer on it.
Exactly. And there are different levels of toast that you can get, much like there are different levels of char. What I love about different levels of toast is that, with char, there are standard accepted times for char. Like char 1 is X amount of seconds. But with toasting, and like it won't matter if you're somewhere in a char, just the heat, you're looking at a generalized time. But toasting, you can really be so precise with your time and your heat and produce such unique flavors. And you just open up a whole nother world of possibilities there that is so exciting as a producer.
It is, and I'm not good talking about it. I guess it was drilled into me. So for so many years, it was proprietary, and nobody else was toasting. Brown-Forman was the only one that we couldn't hardly even talk about it. Because that profile, and we had the different profiles.
Yeah.
Now, what I do love is that with Independent Stave coming in and some of the others, and I just use Independent Stave because they're good to share their data. Andrew is so good. This lets the smaller people that don't have an R&D department, that aren't making their own barrels, to find out, where do I want my char level? What kind of toast profile do I want?
Yeah. Andrew, he does product development and research at ISC, and I might be butchering his title, but I just actually saw him last week at the Beam Institute at University of Kentucky. And my favorite thing about listening to him present about all the research that ISC does, it's my favorite kind of research, because he produces these gorgeous spider charts, and you can just see all of these really outstanding flavors. And they're just, anyone can read this graph, and it's so satisfying to look at. And looking at all of these different char levels, different humidities and temperatures, and all of the really cool research that ISC is doing right now. It's a very exciting time to be picking out barrels. We talked a lot in the industry about the barrel shortage, but with all of the new research that's coming online, there's also a lot of excitement there, I would say. Yeah.
Because a small producer cannot run these experiments. They just can't do it. So I'm so glad. It took big companies to be able to, it took a company the size of Brown-Forman to come out and test on the toasting, because we did this for about 2 or 3 years. Experimenting with what kind of toast profile. We used to have a report, and it was the FU report today was the subject line, and it would tell us our flavor units. But the guy that was doing it, he did it on purpose, but instead of writing out flavor units in the subject, he just put the FU report. But it was an education for us, but we couldn't share it with anybody.
Yeah.
And that's one thing on the craft industry coming in. So much of the research that had been done on whiskey was all proprietary. So you come in and you're wanting to know all these details, and there's no information out there.
Exactly. I mean, I can speak for a lot of my former bosses, that were pioneers on the craft side. And when they started, no one else was really doing it. And they had to figure out so many things. And I had the pleasure of tasting at the American Craft Spirits Association spirits competition like a week or two ago, and just seeing the quality of whiskey that has just blossomed in the past few years, because rising tides raise all ships. And the craft industry in particular loves sharing research, which is why we have ACSA and why we have ADI and why we just love talking to each other about what we're doing. And it really is creating a new standard of whiskey, especially on the craft side, and larger producers are taking notice, which I think is really cool.
It is. And I think that's why I enjoy doing consulting work, is because people are out there wanting to make a good product. And I've seen so much. I can go, you always remember what you don't want to do. I can tell you don't want to do this. So I think you're finding more people like me out there helping. We've had several over the years. Larry Ebersol's been good on distillation. I think barrels was probably the lag as far as somebody really knowing it on the beginning of that, which is why it's been so good that Independent Stave has taken that role. But I think you found that you have more distilling consultants than you did barrel warehousing and understanding the barrel to begin with.
Yeah, for sure. You mentioned a little bit about, moving barrels through warehouses and managing aging stock. And you worked also a lot with developing sensory profiles. Can you talk a little bit about how your warehousing experience informed your sensory panel development and vice versa, just understanding how these barrels were stored and what they were pulling out and how you could translate that to like real-time sensory development?
We did on the sensory panel, but the one thing that we had to keep in mind, and this is the hard part when you work for a big brand, we weren't trying to make better Jack Daniels. We were trying to grow and make consistent Jack Daniels. And that may sound easy, but there is a craft to being consistent. So a lot of ours, we're learning where those honey spots are. Where do we want our single barrels coming from? What area? Okay, these warehouses, they're kind of in the low area. We don't want to mix a lot of that together because we're not going to get the right taste profile. So some of it is not just the sensory, and we did that, but it is understanding which warehouses aged whiskey in a way and which ones you wanted to mingle together. Because you don't want all your whiskey coming from a certain warehouse, a certain floor, a certain area. So at Jack, I know when I left, we had 76 warehouses, and some of them were 4 floors, some of them were 7, and we had some 8 floor. Some were in flat, some were on hills. So it was the sensory panel, but for efficiency's sake, you needed just to know these barrels up here are so good. We can mix them with something that maybe not have the flavor development because that warehouse doesn't get enough sun. It's in the shadow and it's not going to get as much flavor development. So I know that doesn't sound very fancy, but it is knowing your warehouses. It's knowing which floor is going to create this taste profile. So, I'll give an example. It doesn't fall in with sensory, but it shows with the company is these guys were telling me, I was in the lab, in chemistry lab, and they were going, something's not right in this warehouse. And I said, what? And they said, come up here. I'm telling you something's not right. And went up there. And that's when I got in engineering and R&D. And a wet weather spring was leaking water in the warehouse, seeping in. And it was creating too much humidity. But the guys didn't know that there was water, but they knew the whiskey did not smell the same. So you have to get out of your office. I probably went to barrel warehouses, and there were times I would just go walk by myself and have the drill. Okay, what does this side of the warehouse do compared to this side? Because this one's getting so much more sun. So you have to get out there and know kind of the personality of every warehouse.
I think that's great advice because
you can't do it sitting in the office and just at sensory. You have got to get out there and be looking.
Yeah. I mean, and just to go a little bit further, for craft producers who are looking to develop sensory standards or a blending methodology for their products, and they want to learn from how like a larger distilling house does it. Do you have any other great nuggets of advice? Because I love to get out of your office and actually see how
you've got to get out and talk to the people that are in the warehouse every day. Talk to the people that are out there every day. Are you picking up anything any different? Are you seeing, are we having more leaks? And some of it is leaks. Or y'all see a problem on leaks, even though we had a leak hunting crew. But get out of your office and go out there and smell. Take that drill. We took the drill. I was so glad when we went from a whiskey thief. I love that there's the romance of a whiskey thief. But if you've ever sampled with one and knocked the bung out, you're so thankful for the drill and the syringe. But get out there and be tasting it right there in the warehouse. That's one of my advices. And the other one, and not many people take it, but don't forget about the eyes. And that is running the colors and seeing, because flavor and color are so closely related that the darker color is probably going to have more flavor profile, more complex. So this could be whiskey that you're going to need to use for single barrel. Not that you need to use it, you want to use it for single barrel because you want something very complex. But no, that's my big advice is know your warehouse and your storage area to where if you've got a certain kind of blend that you're doing, or if y'all are coming out with a special expression, you know what warehouse to go to and what part of the warehouse, because you know how it ages. And so I always say that you need the objective data. We would do the proof, we would do the color. We did a color analysis on everything we sampled. But that's your objective data, but your sensory is the one that makes the decision. But you don't want one batch of whiskey going out this light color and another one going out a dark color, because your consumers are still seeing that.
1,000%. It's such an interesting piece of advice to recommend looking at color. I like color just because I'm very visually driven. And I do find sometimes it informs me. Sometimes it does create a bias though in me. How do you feel about those sensory programs that have them taste, in black glassware or with the red light that just eliminates all color? Is that something you recommend? Or,
yeah. We have so many biases, so we need that red light. Another one that sounds funny is we were doing, like if we did a triangle or whatever, we would do 1, 2, 3, 4, A, B, C, D. And then we realized there's people that gravitate to B. There's people that gravitate to C's, whatever it is, or certain numbers. So that's when we came up with, doing 3 digits. And we would do those random numbers because it took that bias away. And you've got to do it on the color, because you don't want that to affect your sensory, but on the shelf for your consumer, you do want to take into account that color.
For sure. Yeah. And it's interesting, you're starting to see more of these bottles. There's a recent one, you talked about Lincoln Henderson, the Henderson's new venture has the opaque bottle, which is definitely, I thought it's a very bold choice. And it's an interesting, when I worked in Florida, we used an opaque bottle for some of our products as well. And some consumers thought it was really cool. Some consumers did not like it because they wanted to see the color.
Oh, I think it's the prettiest color in the world. I wish I could get rooms painted that look like whiskey. I think amber whiskey color is the prettiest color in the world. I love it. So I love the look of those bottles, but I'm a little more to where I want to see that color.
Yeah, for sure.
I think for me, just knowing what all it takes to get that color development, I really like to show it off.
Yeah. Do you think the color for Jack Daniel's has stayed consistent since your time there? Or have you seen any SKUs or any other big changes since you've moved on?
No, not really. I think we've always looked at color. We've always used that as one of the criteria.
Yeah.
Again, it is sensory is the final decision, but we've always used that as a criteria. And there is logic to it because of the flavor and the taste development.
Now, taste-wise, do you think the house style of Jack Daniel's has changed at all over the years, especially with, climate change and grain changes and oak changes? And, there are all these things that you hear it all the time from, at least I hear it from people that visit Heaven Hill. They said, oh, I had pre-fire Heaven Hill and it was so different than what you guys are producing at Bernheim now. And, and we have had a lot of people that have gone through our distillery over the years in terms of operators, and we've had a handful of master distillers, and everyone kind of interprets the house style differently. But Jack Daniel's, can you do that with a company like Jack Daniel's, or does it change, or does it stay? That's
our goal. And there's a lot of people that don't care for Jack Daniel's because of the heavy banana notes, and it can be considered a fault at another distillery. But it is part of what our yeast produces, and the way we produce our yeast, it produces that. And that's why I said earlier, our job was not to make better Jack Daniel's.
It was to make Jack Daniel's.
It was to make Old Number 7.
Yeah.
Then with your single barrel, and I love, because they've come out with more since I left. Like I love their triple mash. I think it is fun because you're seeing, and then with the rye, and they're doing more things than we were allowed to do. But I'm glad that we had already set the stage with toasting and some of these experiments that they were able to do this. And I think we've got the technology, the background to do it. And I'm not talking about just at Brown-Forman with other companies. But what we really needed were consumers that were adventurous and wanted to try things. And because just like we said, the sherry finished barrels that we did in the 90s, they did some testing and the consumers weren't ready. They weren't interested in that. So I give a lot of credit to the consumers that we're able to do as many fun things as we can do now. It's not just having one flagship that we keep consistent. We can keep our consistent flagship, but we've got all these curious consumers that we're over there able to try things. One of the things that Jack is doing now, and I'm sure there's other companies, but they have a taster series. So that's where they tested some, let's say, in tequila barrels. Well, they're not calling it Jack Daniels. They don't know whether to make it an expression. But at the visitor center and some liquor stores, you can go in there and taste it. So that way they can get feedback from consumers to know, well, maybe we need to make this an ongoing. Have you seen that done at other distilleries? I think that's the best testing we can do.
We have released some weirder, smaller, more avant-garde things I've seen at Heaven Hill. There's been a mezcal finished one. There's been coffee, also, and they're all the Heaven Hill select stock. And you can only get it at Heaven Hill. And there's a different one every time you go. And it's a great kind of case by case study. How else you can get it as a flight upstairs, and we can kind of subtly collect data just based on sales.
We can collect that. I love that because we would run those experiments and then we would try to figure out what to do with them, work with the TTB. We're like, when we did that with the used barrels, then what do we call it? So we were having to figure out what to do with it. And now you can just put exactly what your experiment is. So I think that opens up even for the larger companies to do more experimenting that goes right directly to the consumer. And y'all's are probably the same way. They're usually a 200 or a 375. So nobody has that commitment of having a 750 of something that they don't like.
Yeah, it's been fun. I didn't know we had those until I got to Heaven Hill and I walked into the gift shop. I'm like, oh my gosh, there's an Armagnac finished whiskey on the shot. I had never heard of it. And it felt very craft to me. And it was nice to see something that felt familiar in terms of its experimentation. Because it's the spice of distilling life. You said you guys ran 2,000 different experiments when you were there. What were some of your favorites? What were some that you just abhorred?
I did not like recharred barrels.
Just from a production standpoint or from a flavor standpoint?
And you don't know how much is your bias, but you finally get put on a panel where you don't know and you did pick out. I do not like that flavor. And somebody else maybe did do it better than we did, but I did not like those experiments. And it wasn't 2,000 different experiments. It was, we would have 2,000 barrels under, because there is so much variation in a barrel. So if you're running an experiment, you can't do it on 10 barrels. So we would have to do maybe 600 barrels, and we would have 100 on the first floor in the flat. We would have 100 on the first floor on a hill. So design an experiment so that you can get data you can collect, because you have to have enough barrels to kind of take care of the variation from barrel to barrel. I think the other thing so that's why doing these experiments, it almost takes a big distillery. Because if you're small and you do 6 barrels, is it because of what you just incorporated in there? Or is it that wood that came in and those barrels were so different? So that's the other one, is I love single barrels. Because our ricks were usually 20 to 25 barrels. And to be in a rick and taste one barrel with the same distillate in it, aged in the same warehouses, side by side, and you taste that much difference. Then you see how much variability there is in a barrel.
And that's where the fun of blending comes in.
Yeah.
And you're doing a lot of blending in your consulting work now.
Yes.
How are you liking that, especially moving away from, we want a standardized product every single batch, to maybe working with some smaller producers who are just trying to blend an artful product, and maybe there isn't as much of a standard to go off of?
Well, that's the fun, is you don't have to just worry about consistency. But the other one that comes into play, and I think this is kind of where it's a hybrid, I'm trying to bring in a hybrid, is let's think long-term about your barrel inventory. Mm-hmm. We don't just pick these 8 barrels and then we leave all these others over here and leave them out. We're going to have to use them eventually. Mm-hmm. So do we create another product? So also I'm trying to bring in barrel management. Mm-hmm. So I'm blending, but also what are we going to do with these other barrels? Because what I find is a lot of people, they do, when they were hand to mouth, it was easy. They do their bottling bond. They had 20 barrels. They dumped all 20 barrels. And it was an order that they dumped in, but it was gone. Now they may have 40 because they increased production and they only use 30. What do you do with those other 10 barrels? Mm-hmm. How do you incorporate that in? So it's kind of a good time to come out there and be helping people manage going from hand to mouth to how do we manage extra inventory? How do we've got some barrels now 7 years old. We've never had 7-year-old whiskey. Well, let's think what we want to do with the 7-year-old whiskey. Mm-hmm. Do we want to blend it or mingle it with some 4-year-old, or do we want to create another product here? So I think that's the fun part of it. I don't know if I explained that well, but it's about management. I always say too, and this is a little harder on the small one, but blending really starts sourcing your corn.
Mm-hmm. I always say that blending at its core is just excellent distillation.
Yes.
It's excellent mashing, it's excellent fermentation, it's excellent distillation. And that's what blending is. You cannot have excellent blending without any of those things.
No, you can't. And I think that's the one part, and people don't realize with Tennessee whiskey, one reason that at Jack we had such an advantage is that most distilleries, you distill, big or small, you distill, and you may have 1 or 2 distillation dates that you put in a barrel. Some may have 4. It's according to what kind of container you have collected from your distillation. But with Tennessee whiskey, once you distill it, then you go through the charcoal mellowing. And we were also set up after charcoal mellowing, Lincoln County process, going through the charcoal. So we would have anywhere from 30 to 60 vats. So your whiskey's coming off the still, going through that. And the way it goes through, you may have, each vat may have 5 distillation dates in it. Then we had 4 large tanks that we equalized at the bottom. So by the time we went in the barrel, we would have anywhere from 14 to 20 distillations going in the same barrel. So I think a true Lincoln County process gets more blending in before you go in the barrel. So you're going in with a more consistent product. I hope I explained that right.
Yeah,
so there's
absolutely.
still care, but you get that consistency. Mm-hmm. And then it comes back to knowing your warehouses. Mm-hmm. And you are deciding where you put those barrels. You don't just put in an empty space. You're planning. I need so much on the first floor. I need some top floor. I need middle floor. I need some flat. So it's your planning. That is when your blending really starts. Mm-hmm. And if you do a good job on your distillation, your sourcing, your distillation, your consistency going in the barrel, and care on building the warehouse or entering into the warehouse, then the end blending, mingling, whatever you want to call it, should be easy. But if you're making a very inconsistent product, you don't manage where you're putting it, then it's going to take a lot more to get not just a consistent, but a good product.
Yeah. I've seen so many craft producers in my time, and even larger producers as well, where they'll have poor beer chemistry and they'll have contaminant issues. And they're like, well, those sins will just age out.
They don't all age out. They
do not age out. If anything, sometimes they become more pronounced.
Yes.
Butyric does not age out I have found that out in my career. That just ggets more baby vomit-y as time goes on.
And it comes back to this management of your barrel warehouse and your inventory and knowing which ones do have an off flavor from distillation. Now, that is where you need the pipe into where you can isolate that, because you don't want to blend it with 25 other distillation dates. You want to be able to manage it.
Yeah.
So you may have to just blend it off 0.5% at a time till you get rid of it.
1,000%. And I think it just also comes down to so many people think, oh, I need to set up a sensory program for my alcohol, and I need to set up a sensory program for my finished spirit. You need to set up a sensory program for every single aspect. You need to set up a sensory program for your raw grain and your fermentation and every aspect of, like, you need to make sure that there is consistency through every single, you need to set up sensory for your water, for your proofing. So there are so many ways that you can incorporate sensory in, and the temptation is just to be, I'll just, I'll taste my new make and make sure that it tastes similar batch to batch. And there are so many different ways that you can incorporate it in that will make your life easier. And
we sampled. So we tested it at 2 years old and 4 years old before we dumped it. So we had 2 times to be tasting it to see if, did it age out or did it not? Because sometimes we didn't even pick it up on the distillation, I call it panel. But at 2 years old, you're going, there's something in the barrel, there's something in the whiskey, there's something just different about this batch. So that's why I believe in sampling at 2 years old and then sampling again and tasting before it's dumped.
Yeah. It's all about kind of what we talked about earlier with your computer science background and just develop your data points.
Yes.
Create your data points. That's what all the big guys do is they just have a ton of data and they pull it from wherever they can possibly get it. And they keep comprehensive records of everything that they do.
Yeah. We kept up with barrels to where I could look at April 15th, 1985, and I could tell you how many wormholes we had, because we kept on entry to how many wormholes were the leaks at the Crows, and that was feedback that we sent back to the cooperage. But what we found is it was also an indicator of the quality of the wood. So the lower the leaker rate, and this took a long time for us it took decades before we had enough data to show, the more leaks we have, the lower our yield's going to be. The angel share just increased. And I don't think it's because we fixed those leaks, but those wormholes and the crow's leaks are an indicator of the quality of the wood, because the men at the cooperage had a harder time building a tight barrel.
That's what you would not expect that either. It's such an inverse. Yeah. That's so interesting.
And so that's the other one. We would have to figure out what was related to the wood and what was related to the men's, and because let me tell you, in Louisville, where our barrels were produced when I was there, the week I hated to see barrels were when U of L and UK were playing. Because nobody cared about barrel quality. All they were doing was talking about the ball game that's going to happen this weekend. And then on Monday, it was all rehashing it.
That's so fun. As someone who's new to Kentucky, I don't particularly care about that rivalry. All I care about is that my Florida Gators beat the University of Kentucky this past week, and I got to go into work this week with my shoulders back and my head held high, and that's enough for me. I don't need to hear any other rivalry game. I'm fine. I can continue living here now.
Oh, well, you are going to learn all the things that happened during the weeks of either football or basketball between U of L and UK.
Yeah.
It's a big rivalry.
I think that is actually kind of a perfect note to close.
Yeah.
It's just Sydney needs the Gators to do better just across the board. And thank God they beat Kentucky. And on top of that, for more than 30 years, G&D Chillers has had the proven solutions for distilleries. Visit them today at gdchillers.com. And if you've enjoyed this podcast, go to spiritsanddistilling.com and sign up for our free newsletter featuring news stories every week from some of the best writers and distillers in the distilling world. ton of really good information there. A lot of my friends also write those, and I learn something from them every time I read them. Sherrie, if people want to learn more or taste for themselves some of the results of the projects you've been working on, how can they dig a bit deeper? How can they learn more about Moore whiskey?
Well, I have signed some NDAs, so I have to be careful, but you can always taste Jack Daniels. Grew up on it, so I always tell people, they'll say, what's your favorite whiskey? And I said, I don't know if I've got a favorite, but my most familiar is Jack Daniels.
Your proudest achievement.
Yes,
I mean, Jack Daniels would not be Jack Daniels without Sherrie Moore.
Well, I grew up to where when you're teething in Lynchburg, they rub your gums with whiskey. If you've got a cough, you're drinking Jack Daniels. So familiar with me. And then I helped with Uncle Nearest getting started in designing their distillery, and I'm helping with Leaper's Fork in Tennessee right now, and some others, but I'm having fun. It's good to get into the Leaper's Fork and get back with their distillery and making their own whiskey and blending from that rather than just source barrel. So I'm enjoying that.
And you're on LinkedIn professionally
I'm on LinkedIn,
as well.
Sherrie Moore, and then on Instagram is Sherrie Moore Whiskey.
Yep. And you can find out more information there. So thank you guys so much for listening to Sherrie and I catch up about all things Jack. I cannot thank you enough because I've learned a lot about how Jack Daniels operates, and that was extraordinarily interesting for me. We will be back in 2 weeks with another in-depth distilling conversation for you. Thanks for joining us. Cheers.
This podcast has been brought to you by Spirits and Distilling for those who love to make and drink great spirits. Join our free newsletter today at spiritsanddistilling.com for pragmatic, technical, and creative distilling stories in your inbox every week. Sign up now at spiritsanddistilling.com or click on the link in the show notes.